The rain had been falling for 40 minutes before Daniel Whitmore realized he had forgotten them. Not misplaced. Not delayed. Forgotten. His 2 children were standing outside Westbrook Academy in the November rain, and he was sitting in a board meeting on the 29th floor of a building that bore his name, listening to a woman explain a quarterly variance he no longer cared about, because his phone had just lit up with a text from the school office, and the words on that screen had reached into his chest and turned something cold. He did not walk out of the room. He ran. The elevator took 11 seconds. It felt like a season. He stood in the polished steel box, watching the numbers drop and thinking of Oliver, who was 7 and refused to wear his raincoat because he said it made him look like a banana, and Emma, who was 9 and would never complain about standing in the rain, even if she was dissolving into the pavement. That was the thing about Emma. She didn't ask for things. She just waited, quietly, in the way that broke you later, when you finally understood how long she had been waiting. He called the school from the car. The office manager, a calm woman named Mrs. Parents, told him that his children were fine, that they were dry, that they had been brought inside out of the rain approximately 30 minutes ago. He exhaled. He asked who had brought them in. There was a pause on the line. She said her name was Dorothy, Mrs. Parents said. She was here when we came out to check on them. She'd already taken off her coat and put it over the little one. She was reading to them from a book she found in the lost property box. She said she works at your house, Mr. Whitmore, Dorothy. He had not thought of her name in 3 weeks. She cleaned his house every Tuesday and Friday, had done so for 2 years, moved through the rooms like weather, present, necessary, unremarked upon. He knew she arrived at 8 and left at 4, and that she always refolded the towels into thirds when his housekeeper Margaret left them in halves. He did not know her last name. He was not sure, in that moment in the car with the rain hammering the roof, that he had ever asked. What no one at Whitmore Capital knew was that the afternoon that was about to change everything had actually begun 3 days earlier, in a way that had nothing to do with rain or school or forgotten children. It had begun with a phone call from Carolyn. Carolyn was the woman Daniel was supposed to marry. Had been supposed to marry for 2 years now, in the way that things are supposed to happen when 2 people are exhausted enough by grief and circumstance that the path of least resistance begins to look like love. She was polished and particular, and she ran his household social calendar the way she ran everything, by identifying what she wanted and eliminating anything that stood between her and it. She had called on the Tuesday, 3 days before the rain, to tell Daniel that Dorothy had been stealing from the house. She said it with the precision of someone who had been saving the accusation. She said the kitchen inventory had been off for 6 weeks. That food was disappearing. Portions wrapped from the refrigerator, items from the pantry, tinned goods from the shelf above the boiler room door. She said it always corresponded to Dorothy's shifts. She said she had confirmed it with Margaret. She said she was sorry to be the one to tell him, but someone in the house had to. Daniel had listened. He was a man who had built a company on the ability to read evidence without sentiment, and the evidence, as Carolyn presented it, was orderly and specific. Shift logs. An inventory that repeated its discrepancy every Tuesday and every Friday without variation. A pattern clean enough to be entered into a spreadsheet. He had said he would handle it. He had not handled it in 3 days because something in him was reluctant to handle it, and he could not explain the reluctance, which annoyed him. He was not a sentimental man. He had fired executives. He had ended partnerships that spanned decades. He did not understand why the idea of confronting a housekeeper about stolen food was sitting in him like a stone he couldn't shift. He understood it slightly better now, pulling into the Westbrook Academy car park in the rain, because through the glass doors of the reception foyer he could see his daughter Emma and his son Oliver sitting on a bench. And Dorothy was sitting between them, and she was using her hands to demonstrate something. Some kind of counting game. Her fingers moving. Both children leaning toward her in that specific way children lean toward people they feel completely safe with. The way they lean toward no one else in the world, except the people they love. He sat in the car for a moment he couldn't account for. Then he went inside. She stood up when she saw him. She was a small woman, somewhere in her mid-40s, with the particular stillness of someone who has learned through long practice to take up no more space than the situation requires. She was wearing her work clothes still, dark trousers, a gray top, and no coat, because her coat was draped around Oliver's shoulders, still damp at the collar. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Not an apology, not an explanation, just his name, steady and even, the way you greet someone when you don't owe them anything. Oliver launched off the bench and hit him around the middle with enough force to suggest the day had been longer than 30 minutes of rain. Emma stood and said, "Dorothy read us a whole chapter in the tone of someone reporting the results of an investigation." He looked at Dorothy. She was already reaching to take her coat back from Oliver's shoulders, folding it over her arm in a single efficient motion. "I happened to be passing," she said. "I'd finished for the afternoon, and I was taking the long way to the bus stop. I recognized them." She said it plainly, without the decorative humility people sometimes attach to kind acts to make them easier for others to receive. She had done a thing. She had explained it. That was all. He thanked her. She nodded once, said goodbye to the children by name, Oliver first, then Emma, who she looked at for a second longer than was necessary, the way you look at a child you're privately worried about. And then she walked out of the foyer and into the rain. He took his children to the car. He did not think about the inventory discrepancy on the drive home. He thought about it later, after dinner, after Emma had gone to bed and Oliver had fallen asleep on the sofa with a felt tip pen still in his hand. He sat in the kitchen with a glass of water, and Carolyn's voice from 3 days ago arranging itself in his mind with the precision it always achieved eventually. The shift logs, the dates, the correspondence. Tuesday, Friday, Tuesday, Friday. He decided he would speak to her on Friday. He was wrong about that too. The call came Thursday morning from Margaret, his head housekeeper, who had been with the Whitmore household for 14 years, and who Daniel trusted with the kind of unexamined completeness you extend only to people who have never given you a reason to doubt them. Margaret called at 7:40 and said she needed to speak to him before Dorothy arrived. She was already in the kitchen when he came down. She had made tea she wasn't drinking. She sat at the end of the table, and she placed a folder on the surface in front of her, with the deliberateness of someone who has spent the night deciding to do something they would rather not do. Inside the folder was a printed copy of the household inventory for the past 8 weeks. Every Tuesday, every Friday. Items circled in red pen. The quantities were modest, never expensive, never obvious. Tins of soup, dried pasta, a jar of honey that had been near full on Monday and was nearly empty by Wednesday, half a bag of rice, a bottle of cooking oil that had been replaced twice in 6 weeks. "I noticed it about 2 months ago," Margaret said. "I didn't say anything because I thought I was miscounting. But it's consistent." She pressed her lips together. "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore." He looked at the folder. He looked at the circles in red pen. He thought about Dorothy's coat around his son's shoulders in the rain. He said, "When does she arrive?" 8 o'clock. "Don't say anything to her. I'll speak to her myself. Margaret nodded and picked up her tea and held it without drinking it and said, very quietly, "She's a good worker, Mr. Whitmore. She always has been. I want to say that. I know she is," he said. He waited in the study. He heard the door at 8. He heard Dorothy in the hall, removing her shoes the way she always did. The small sounds of her arrival that he had never noticed he'd memorized. He waited another 10 minutes, which was long enough to feel like punishment for something he hadn't done yet. And then he walked to the kitchen. She was at the sink, already working. She turned when she heard him and said good morning, and something in her face registered the particular quality of his silence. "I need to speak to you," he said. "Of course." She dried her hands and turned to face him fully and stood with her hands at her sides, very still. He told her about the inventory. He kept his voice level. He was not cruel. He did not consider himself the kind of man who was cruel to employees, but he was direct, because he had always believed that directness was a form of respect. He laid out the dates. He described the pattern. He told her what Carolyn had noticed and what Margaret had confirmed. He told her that the evidence was consistent and that he needed to understand what had been happening. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is not absence but presence, someone thinking, not retreating. Then she said, "I understand why it looks the way it looks." Her voice was low and even. She was looking directly at him. "I didn't take those things for myself, Mr. Whitmore, and I know that saying so is exactly what someone would say if they had. So I'm not asking you to take my word for it." A pause. "But if you let me go without proof, if you decide the pattern is enough, that will say more about this house than it will ever say about me." He had been in rooms with lawyers and executives and opponents of considerable intelligence, and he had almost never been without a response. He stood in his own kitchen and found that he had none. The sentence had closed itself off completely, the way an argument does when it is not actually an argument, but simply the truth. What he said was, "I'm going to need to ask you to leave for the day while I look into this further." She nodded. She collected her things. She said goodbye to Margaret in the hallway with a composure that Margaret later told him had nearly finished her entirely. And then she was gone. He sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the door closed. He called Carolyn. She answered on the second ring, and her voice carried the specific satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for a resolution she already decided on. She said she was glad he'd finally addressed it. She said she knew it was difficult. She said some people simply could not be trusted regardless of how long you'd employed them, and that this was just the reality of running a household at a certain level, and that she could recommend an agency with better background checks. He held the phone against his ear and looked at the kitchen and did not say what he was thinking, which was that he had just done something he was not certain he should have done. He hung up. He thought about it for 4 hours. He thought about the inventory and the circles and the dates and the pattern. And he thought about the coat in the rain and the counting game with fingers and the way Emma had said Dorothy read us a whole chapter in the tone of someone reporting the most significant event of the week. He thought about what Margaret had said. "She's a good worker, Miss Whitmore. She always has been." He thought about Carolyn's voice and the specific satisfaction in it. At 2 in the afternoon, he got in his car. He did not call the agency Margaret had used to find Dorothy. He did not call his lawyer. He did not call anyone. He drove to the end of his street and sat at the junction for a moment, thinking about what he was doing and whether he was the kind of man who did this, and decided that he was, because he needed to understand, and the only way he was going to understand was to see it. He knew which bus she took because Margaret had mentioned it once, the number 47, running north from the bottom of Alton Street. He had a general sense of north in this city. He knew the bridge, the industrial quarter, the warehouses that had been converted into apartments for young architects, and beyond that, the places the GPs had names for, but he had never visited. He drove north and kept his distance and told himself he was doing due diligence, which was the story he would need to believe about himself for the next 40 minutes. The city changed around him in the way cities do when you keep going past the last point you've ever needed to go. The buildings lost their height first, then their renovation, then their confidence. A shopping parade with metal shutters down at 2 in the afternoon. A laundromat with handwritten hours taped to the window. A small park that had been intended as green space and had become instead a collection of benches at angles that suggested they'd stopped being arranged and started just being placed. The pavements were older here, the kind that heaved and cracked, and nobody came to fix. Puddles from yesterday's rain still standing in the dips. The bus stop ahead, orange in the gray afternoon. She stepped off with 2 bags, one canvas, one plastic, and turned left down a street he couldn't name on any map he'd ever consulted. He followed slowly, far enough back that the wet road between them was its own kind of privacy. She turned again. The street narrowed. The terraced houses here had the particular exhaustion of buildings that had been holding themselves together through sheer stubbornness for longer than anyone could reasonably expect. Their front walls darkened with moisture, their gates missing or loose on single hinges. A dog barked from somewhere inside a house and then stopped. A child's bicycle lay on its side on a strip of concrete that had once been a front garden. She did not live in the first house she passed, or the second or the third. She passed 6 more before she slowed. The house was the last on the row before the street ended against a low brick wall. It was smaller than the others, or perhaps it only seemed smaller because the curtain in the front window was darker, heavier, the kind that keeps warmth in rather than light out. The front gate was missing entirely. The path to the door was cracked but swept clean, recently, carefully, the kind of thing you do when the condition of a thing is fixed, but the attitude toward it doesn't have to be. There was a new lock on the door, not expensive, but newer than everything around it, and she had the key out before she reached the step, which meant she'd been thinking about it since the bus. He pulled in at the end of the row and turned the engine off. The rain had started again, lightly, the kind of rain that doesn't announce itself, just accumulates. He could see the side of the house from where he sat, and one window, ground floor, thin curtain, yellow light behind it. He did not go to the front door. He did not know what he would have said. He sat and watched the light and felt the particular stupidity of a man who is very good at knowing things and has just discovered a limit. Then, through the thin curtain and the rain, he heard it. Not words at first. A tone. A voice, small, close, warm, that carried the specific quality of a child who is not performing happiness, but is simply inside it, the way children are when they are briefly and completely safe. And then, clearer, Mom, you're home. He had not been prepared for that. He sat very still. He heard her voice answer, lower, quieter than the voice he knew from his kitchen, softer at the edges. The voice of someone who is a different person in this room than the one she presents to the world, which is not a deception, but simply the ordinary miracle of a private self. He heard movement, the scrape of something on a floor, what might have been a chair pushed back. And then another voice, older than the first, still a child, a girl, saying something he couldn't catch, and then catching, clearly, in a gap when the rain paused. Did you bring the honey? Thomas couldn't eat his breakfast again. He felt as though the floor had moved, Not dramatically, not in the way of earthquakes, but in the way of a man who has been standing on something he believed was solid and has just felt it shift a centimeter. 1 centimeter is enough when you've been confident. He stayed very still in his car and listened. He heard the canvas bag being opened, the sound of tins, the soft knock of a jar. He heard the child say something that sounded like his name, Thomas, and then the sound of movement upstairs, bare feet on old floorboards. And then a third voice, smaller than the others, a boy's voice, no more than 5 or 6 years old, calling down from somewhere above him, "Is there soup?" She said she'd bring soup. He thought about the inventory. He thought about the circles in red pen. He thought about Carolyn's voice and its particular satisfaction, and the agency with better background checks. Then the girl's voice again, closer to the window, and this time he heard it fully, and it was not directed at him, and it was not directed at her mother, and it was not directed at anyone who could respond to it, because it was a question that had no person in the room capable of answering it. Does Dad know we're hungry? Can he tell? From heaven? He put his forehead against the steering wheel. He did not know how long he sat like that. Long enough that the light through the curtain changed, warm and steady. Long enough that the rain stopped again. Long enough that when he finally raised his head and put his hands on the steering wheel to start the engine, his hands were shaking badly enough that he had to wait and breathe before he could trust them. He drove back through the city in reverse. The warehouses, the bridge, the buildings growing back their height and their renovation and their confidence. And none of it was the same. He was home by 6. He sat in the kitchen and called Margaret and asked her 2 questions. She answered them both. The second one was about Dorothy's husband. His name had been Samuel. He had worked construction. There had been an accident at a site in the northern industrial quarter 4 years ago now, a site contracted to a company that had since been absorbed, acquired, restructured, renamed, absorbed into Whitmore Capital. He was very quiet on the phone. Margaret said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Whitmore," he said. "Margaret, who told Carolyn about the inventory?" There was a pause. "I told her," Margaret said, 3 weeks ago. She'd been asking questions about Dorothy specifically, asking how long she'd worked here, who she saw, what she had access to. I thought she was doing a routine check. I showed her the records and she asked me to keep counting. She said she'd speak to you when she had enough for a pattern. Another pause. Longer. I realize now I should have spoken to you directly. "I'm sorry. I made an error." He thanked her. He sat in the kitchen for another long time after the call ended. He thought about a woman who kept her curtains closed to keep the warmth in. He thought about a new lock that was newer than everything around it. He thought about tins of soup and a jar of honey carried home on a bus in the rain, and a girl who asked questions of heaven because there was no one left on earth to ask. He thought about Carolyn. He called her at 7:45. She answered in the middle of what sounded like a dinner, her voice pitched for company, pleasant and slight. He told her he needed her to come to the house tomorrow morning. He told her he needed to speak to her about the inventory records she had asked Margaret to compile. He told her he had spoken to Dorothy, and that he had followed her home, and that he now had a complete picture of what had been happening. There was a silence on the line. "Daniel," she said, "she's been stealing from. She's been feeding 3 children," he said. "Her children, who have been living without a father for 4 years because he died on a site I now own. What I need to discuss with you tomorrow is why you wanted her gone, Carolyn, because the inventory is not a reason. The inventory is a story you built around a reason you haven't said aloud." He hung up before she could answer. He called Dorothy's number at 8. She answered carefully, as if she'd been waiting for the call and had decided to receive it with no particular expression. He said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have words for tonight. I'd like to offer you a longer version in person, if you'll allow me." She was quiet. Then she said, "My children are fed, Mr. Whitmore. That's what I'd like you to know. Tonight they're fed, and that's enough for tonight." "I know," he said, "but it shouldn't have been this hard. And it won't be any more. Not if you'll let me tell you what I'd like to do." She said she would listen. He told her she didn't need to decide anything that evening. He asked if he could come to her the next morning, rather than asking her to come to him. She said yes, with the same steadiness she brought to everything. The quality he now understood was not passivity, but a refusal to spend herself on ceremony. He was at her door at 9. Carolyn had arrived at his house at 9:15, as instructed, and found Margaret waiting in the hall, and a letter on the kitchen table, which Margaret had been asked to give to her. The letter contained 3 things: a summary of what Daniel had learned, a clear statement about the end of their personal arrangement, effective immediately, and a formal note advising that her access to Whitmore household accounts and staff records was revoked, and that if any legal dispute arose from the matter, he had retained counsel. Margaret delivered the letter with the expression of a woman who has waited 14 years to deliver a letter like it. Carolyn left without speaking. The morning at Dorothy's house was not dramatic. He had half expected it to be, expected something large and formal, a scene of reckoning, but it was none of those things. He sat at a small kitchen table while Thomas, who was 6 and very thin, and watched him with the frank appraisal of a child who has learned to make fast judgments about adults, ate a bowl of cereal across from him. The girl, Rosie, had gone to school. The oldest, a boy named James, who was 12, and who carried himself with the particular gravity of someone who has been the man of the house since he was 8, made tea without being asked, and set it down in front of Daniel, and then stood against the wall as though deciding whether to stay. Dorothy sat across from Daniel and listened to what he said. He told her that Samuel's accident was under review. He told her that the site protocols at the time had been inadequate and that the company responsible had been absorbed into his organization, which meant the liability was a question he intended to answer properly, not legally, but morally. He told her that the Whitmore Foundation was going to establish a fund, named for Samuel, formally and publicly, covering education for the children of workers who had died in contracted site incidents. He told her that if she was willing, there was a position at Whitmore Capital, real, permanent, not charity but earned, overseeing the new employee welfare program he was going to build. Because he now understood that he had been running a company for 15 years, without adequately knowing what was happening in the lives of the people who kept it running. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. She looked at her hands on the table. Then she said, "I want to stay in this house, with my children. I want them to know where they grew up. Then you will," he said. James, from his position against the wall, said nothing. But Daniel saw him look at his mother, and then back at the floor, and the thing on his face was not quite relief, because boys who have been carrying weight that long don't put it down all at once. But it was something in the direction of relief, something loosening. Thomas finished his cereal and pushed the bowl an inch across the table and said, without looking up, "Are you the man whose house Mum cleans?" Daniel said yes. Thomas considered this. "She never says anything bad about it," he said. "She never says anything bad about you." He drove back through the city and stood in his own kitchen for a long time. The house was the same. The marble was the same. The height of the windows was the same. It felt different in a way he couldn't attribute to any particular change in the room. Margaret made coffee without being asked. They sat at the table together in silence for a few minutes, which was the closest either of them came to commemorating the morning. "She'll need references," he said finally, "for the new role. Something formal." "I'll write one," Margaret said. "A real one." "So will I," he said. The Samuel Okafor Education Fund was announced publicly 11 weeks later, with Dorothy present at the ceremony, standing with her 3 children in the kind of quiet that is not absence but arrival. James had grown half an inch by then, or seemed to have. Thomas asked 3 questions during the announcement that required the lawyer to lean over and whisper the answers. Rosie held the folder of press materials and studied them with the earnestness of someone who intends to read everything carefully before deciding what to think. That evening, Daniel's cook prepared a meal at the house, and Dorothy came, and Margaret came, and the children came, and they sat around a table that was larger than it needed to be, and noisier than it had ever been, and Oliver put his knife in his water glass by accident, and Emma corrected him in a tone of such perfect elder sister authority that the table laughed in a way that filled the room from floor to ceiling. Dorothy looked at Daniel across the table at one point, briefly, with no particular expression, and he understood without language that the thing between them was not friendship yet, and perhaps would never be friendship, and didn't need to be. It was something else, something without a clean name. The relationship between a man who looked and finally saw, and a woman who had been there all along, holding herself together through the same quiet stubbornness as the house on the end of the row, waiting for no one to rescue her, but allowing, just allowing, someone to finally look. Later, when the children had migrated to the sitting room and the adults were clearing plates with the comfortable inefficiency of people who are not in a hurry to end an evening, a candle on the sideboard flickered in a way that had no draft to explain it, just once. A single long, still flame that moved without wind and then was steady. Margaret saw it. She didn't say anything. Some things don't require commentary. They require only that someone was present to witness them. If you have ever carried something that was too heavy to explain and too necessary to put down, you know what Dorothy knew every Tuesday and every Friday on that bus ride north through the changing city. You know the specific weight of a life that belongs entirely to someone else, to the people in your house, the small faces that need things you cannot always provide, but that you provide anyway, through the exhaustion and the rain and the long bus ride home, because there is no other option you would choose. If you have ever been seen too late by someone who should have seen you earlier, you understand that the seeing is still worth something, even when it arrives behind schedule. What she carried out of that house every night was never small enough to fit inside an inventory. It was never visible on any camera. It was the weight of being someone's everything, quietly, without recognition, in the spaces between all the things the world considers important. And it was the kind of weight that, if it is not crushed by the carrying, eventually becomes the foundation that everything else is built on.